My name is Bond, James Bond. My instructions were implicit. I was to leave for Jamaica in 2 hours. License to kill.
Now you maybe miss it.
You don't miss a thing.
I decided to accept your invitation.
I have to leave immediately.
Just as things were getting interesting again.
Alright, time for the first of many Bond films to talk about, Dr. No. But first, a brief history lesson. As most people know, the films were based off of the James Bond novels written by Ian Fleming. An American film producer, Albert R. Broccoli, also known by his nickname Cubby, had achieved some success producing films in Europe, but found himself in financial trouble after producing The Trials of Oscar Wilde, which, while critically acclaimed, was a massive box office flop. He saw the Bond novels as being capable of adaptation to the big screen and wanted to obtain the rights to make them, but found a Canadian producer named Harry Saltzman had the rights to them instead. Cubby wanted to purchase the rights from Harry, but he declined, instead opting to co-produce the films together. Cubby agreed, and the two forged a partnership that would go on for well over a decade, beginning with the first film, Dr. No, directed by Terence Young and released in 1962.
James Bond, 007. License to kill whom he pleases, where he pleases, when he pleases.
I always thought it was one of the more unique films in the series, mostly because it was the first one, or rather, the first one to be made under United Artists and Eon Productions. Due to it being the first, there's a lot of differences between this film and the others that followed. I saw all the Bond films out of order as a kid, so I have to admit I was pretty shocked when I first saw the gun barrel sequence and it opened with some weird jingle instead of the Bond theme. Then, all of a sudden, the theme starts blaring and a strobe light show happens in the opening credits. Then, it cuts to people dancing to a jig followed by 3 blind mice. It sounds weird describing it, but if you think about it, it's the perfect way to introduce things to the audience. The 007 theme naturally represents James Bond and the danger of the mission he undertakes, and the instrumental music represents the setting where the film takes place. Speaking of James Bond, he's played by none other than Scotland's national treasure, Sir Sean Connery. It goes without saying that Connery's portrayal of Bond is legendary. To some, he literally is Bond, and honestly, I can see why some people would think that. Throughout the film, he's depicted as suave and coolly charismatic, while also being cold and calculating when he needs to be. He's the literal personification of the Bond character from the novels, which is funny considering he looks nothing like how Ian Fleming describes him. Paraphrasing Fleming's words, he described him as having a slim build, a 3-inch long thin vertical scar on his right cheek, blue-gray eyes, a cruel mouth, short black hair, and a comma of which rests on his forehead. Naturally, Fleming was not too impressed when Connery was cast as Bond, since he didn't represent his ideal vision, but he eventually changed his mind after seeing how successful Dr. No ended up being in the box office. He even went on to change Bond's family history in the 1964 novel You Only Live Twice, declaring Bond's father as Scottish in honor of Connery. Anyway, like I said, Connery is great as Bond. He's both charming and likable, and serious and blunt when he needs to be. As for the plot itself, this film involves an MI6 station chief named Strangways who goes missing in Jamaica. He's killed by assassins in disguise, and they proceed to steal secret documents from his home, so Bond is ordered by MI6 to investigate the matter. In this sense, it's very much a classic spy film, where the character, in this case James Bond, has to go around looking for clues to go about completing his objective, all while trying to stay 2 steps ahead of the enemy who are trying to prevent him from discovering their plans. One of the things I like about the earlier Connery films is we see him interacting with every facet of his environment. He's making sure there's no traps or hidden equipment anywhere in his room all the time. He even goes so far as to plant one of his hairs in the middle of a doorway so he knows that someone would sneak into it. One of my favorite scenes is when Bond finds out who's responsible for Strangway's disappearance, and he sets up a trap to interrogate the culprit, all while playing a game of solitaire like it's just another day on the job. The cat and mouse games are great, especially when Bond gets to throw in a dry one-liner.
Who are you working for, Professor?
Well, you might as well know, as you won't live to use the information. I'm working for...
Mr. Smith & Wesson. And you've had your 6.
Of course, Bond isn't the only character in the film who contributes to the story. The other leading character is the first of many Bond girls. In a nutshell, they're basically women who are more or less associated with Bond throughout the story of every Bond film. Well, almost every Bond film. In Dr. No, the Bond girl is none other than Honey Rider, played by the beautiful Ursula Andress. I don't think anything I say can highlight how iconic her presence is in this film. Of course, everyone talks about the white bikini scene as she's emerging from the ocean, but what really struck me when I rewatched this film years later was how fleshed out her character was. Being that this is the first film in the series, I expected her character would be used purely as arm candy for the hero of the story, but she actually has a chilling backstory and a concrete goal.
Well, there was this man who owned the place where we were living. He let me stay on for a while without paying. Then one night he came up to my room. Well, you know. I scratched his face, and then... But he was stronger than I was.
And what happened after that?
I put a black widow spider underneath his mosquito net. A female, and they're the worst. It took him a whole week to die.
I also like how she gets into fights with guards and doesn't just fall in love with Bond right away at the beginning, at least not without showing off a pretty feisty personality.
I promise I won't steal your shells.
I promise you won't either.
Both Bond and Honey's journey take them to Dr. No, the villain where the film gets its name from. He's played by Joseph Wiseman and does a terrific job in the role. The way he stares at Bond when they finally meet sends chills down my spine, yet he's so calm and collected in the way he speaks to him, like Bond doesn't even register as a threat, merely a blip on the radar. And he's got metal hands to boot, so there's your obligatory gimmick. This is also the first time in the series we see the introduction of the terror organization Spectre, and its full name is quite a mouthful.
I'm a member of Spectre.
Spectre?
Spectre. Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, Extortion.
His evil plan is to disrupt an American space mission launch from Cape Canaveral. Pretty basic as far as evil plots go, but it's the first movie, so it's excusable, and Wiseman's performance makes up for this scenario.
Unfortunately, I misjudged you. You are just a stupid policeman whose luck is run out.
As far as other supporting cast goes, there's the group at MI6 that makes an appearance together in just about every Bond film. M, played by Bernard Lee, Moneypenny, played by Lois Maxwell, and Q, played by... wait, Q? Oh yeah, that's right, Dr. No is the only film in the series where he wasn't actually called Q, but instead by the name Major Boothroyd. This is due to the influence of a real-life person by the name Jeffrey Boothroyd, a firearms enthusiast who actually corresponded with Ian Fleming in the past. He wrote a letter to Fleming declaring that he enjoyed the Bond novels, but disagreed with Bond's choice of sidearm as a Beretta, stating that Bond should use a Walther PBK instead.
My first contact with Ian Fleming was after reading Casino Royale. I enjoyed this immensely. So much so that certain inaccuracies in the book made me write to Fleming and say that I didn't think Bond was going to last very long if he used a 2.5 Beretta pistol, which is a lady's gun and not a very nice lady at that, and used his chamois leather holster.
As a result, Fleming would go on to change the sidearm in future novels beginning with Dr. No, which is also seen in the film itself. There's a few other supporting characters as well, both good guys and bad guys, one of which is Felix Leiter, played by Jack Lord, the first of many, many actors to play the role. Aside from that, not much else stands out, which is disappointing, but again, it's the first film, so we'll let it slide. So what did I like about this film? Well, I've already talked about the characters. Sean Connery's fantastic as Bond, Ursula is memorable as Honey Ryder, and Joseph Wiseman is chilling as Dr. No. But aside from the characters, when most people talk about the Bond films, it all comes down to individual scenes. For me, Dr. No is an example where every scene is one gigantic piece of eye candy. For the time it was made, Dr. No is an extremely beautiful film to look at. Now, I know I'm watching it on a Blu-ray disc today, and my memory of the VHS tapes of old is a bit fuzzy, but even then I remember being impressed with the color palette. Everything looks vibrant and energetic, just as you would expect Jamaica to be. The music complements this as well, especially during the scene where Bond's at the club. There's a live band playing at the scene, and everyone goes crazy dancing, especially him. What the hell is this guy doing? But as far as my favorite scene goes, it'd have to be the spider scene. Right beforehand, we see the man responsible for Strangway's death arriving at Crab Key, the island where Dr. No resides. He enters this big room, gets terrified by Dr. No's threatening him for failing to kill Bond earlier, and receives the spider to finish the job. I have to say, at this point, the sets are absolutely jaw-dropping. They're massive, picturesque, and they perfectly fit the larger-than-life world that Bond inhabits. They were all designed by Ken Adam, whose work was so impressive that Stanley Kubrick hired him to work on Dr. Strangelove. Anyway, once the spider's reintroduced in Bond's hotel room, that's when things start getting real intense. The shots were filmed back-to-back between Connery and the spider with a plate of glass between them, and close-ups of the spider walking on Connery's stuntman, Bob Simmons, who reportedly said this was the most frightening stunt he ever performed. Even though I've seen this scene several times, it never gets old, and the music is pretty funny at the end. Now for some of the things I don't like. While it's definitely not as action-packed as later Bond films, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad film. It's just a bit slower paced than the others, which, if you're watching the series out of order, I can see how it might sour some people's opinions. Honestly, aside from being pretty ordinary by today's standards as far as spy films are concerned, there's nothing really bad about it. But there's one thing that does annoy me a little bit, and that's the editing. For the most part, the film is edited pretty well, and you can follow the story easily from point A to point B. But every now and then, there's two things that come up that start to grate on my patience. First is the jump cuts. There's a lot of moments during the action scenes where jump cuts are implemented, and they just feel unnecessary and distracting. I wouldn't have been annoyed by them so much, except that in the documentary that comes with my Blu-ray, the editor and other crew from the film defend the style as innovative.
Hunt's innovative style of cutting creates a breathtaking sense of movement.
I didn't wait for movement to stop me from cutting from one thing to the other and keeping the timing of the sequences going.
Breathtaking sense of movement.
The second problem in the editing is the use of the Bond theme. Now, I don't mind the fact that it's used in the opening title sequence, and the way it's used to introduce Bond's first on-screen appearance is a nice touch. But after that, it feels like it appears every time Bond arrives at a new location or finds a new clue to his mission. It gets old really quick.
I'd like to send a cable.
Yes, of course. Oh, by the way, the car you ordered.
Well, you did invite me, remember?
Oh, of course. I just didn't expect you here so soon. Yes, come in.
Overall though, Dr. No is a pretty solid start for the franchise. For the time it was made, it's incredible what they were able to achieve with a budget of just over $1 million. The set designs, the miniature models used for special effects, and the tropical setting of Jamaica all look amazing. And of course, Sean Connery is one of the definitive actors to play the role. I do think it pales in comparison to Bond films in later years. There's not much in the way of action, it's slower paced, and it doesn't have quite all the elements that would go together to create the Bond formula. But again, this isn't really a detriment because you can't really compare this film to, say, Casino Royale. Both of them were made in completely different eras, and as times change, so do audiences' tastes. For me personally, Dr. No is one of Connery's best. The seemingly innocent tropical setting of Jamaica is the perfect contrast for the sinister plans of a mad scientist living on his own private island, and the film has a lot of fun with this premise. So as long as you go into this film understanding it's the first and definitely not the worst, then you'll have a good time. This concludes my review of Dr. No. Thank you for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for the next review of From Russia with Love.